So I decided to try, that's how the first McLaren F1 came out. I decided I wanted that. So yeah, at the time I was fortunate to have the McLaren F1 and the 220S. So I could probably give you a direct comparison between the two.
Welcome to the first instalment in our series of interviews with Chris Palmer. Over the years, Chris has owned at least one of pretty much all of our ultimate dream cars, from the McLaren F1 GTR to the Ferrari F40 LM and even a road-legal Porsche 962. In this mini-series, we'll chat to Chris about his eclectic car history and some of the best stories behind the most iconic cars of the past 30 years. Starting with the McLaren F1.
The cars that were involved were the McLaren F1 GTR, which was chassis number 16. That was one of the two factory Bugatti racing cars run by Charlie Lamb. And at the same time I'd got the Enzo, the Ferrari Enzo. So pretty much at the time they were the top of the league sort of cars. So yeah, it sort of aroused their interest, if you like. Basically, fifth gear, Tiffany Dell. At the time, we were running a bar cum restaurant down in the town, and I approached them for Tiff and for Jason Plato, who was his co-presenter at the time, to come and do a sort of question and answer gentleman's sports dinner. We'd had a few of the sports stars, and so we spoke, and then his agent rang me from Fifth Gear. We got talking about cars, and he said, "Oh, you're into cars?" And I said, "Yeah, I've got a couple of cars," kind of thing, 2 or 3 cars. Like, what sort of cars have you got? And it sort of rolled on from there. When they found out what they were, that was the deal. There was no payment. I didn't pay him. I loaned them the 2 cars, and he came and did the gentleman's sportsman's dinner for us. Came to the house, obviously did. If you've seen the film, came to the house, obviously sort of bit of an interview. And then obviously sort of road tested the cars, gave them his impressions, driving impressions of the 2 car. And at the end of it, he summed it up with which one was his favourite, which was the McLaren, which was the F1 GTR. If I'd have known at the time that you could actually, you know, like some of the influencers do now, I would have got paid for it from him too. I think it's had about 10 million hits up to just. They were pretty much at the you know, I mean, as I think I famously said at the time, I don't back horses. You know, I don't sort of, that was my hobby, and so to have them both at the same time, it was pretty much all I'd ever wanted. Yeah, we've been to Le Mans. There used to be like a group of guys, certainly more than 20 times. Used to be a collection of guys, 15 guys or so, all going down in, you know, various Porsches, Lambos, whatever, Ferraris. So I actually preferred at the time, and probably still do, I preferred the Le Mans type cars, the sports cars, to the Formula 1 cars. You know, that was always my sort of preference. I was certainly there when 16R raced, and was on pole position in the GT class with Piquet, Nelson Piquet, one of my all-time favourite drivers, Piquet and Soper. As I say, that car only did 2 races. It did the Silverstone race, which was the sort of warm-up for Le Mans, and it was on pole position for that race with Piquet, Soper and I think Lafitte. And then after that race, where unfortunately I think Soper ran it out of fuel, and so it dropped from leading the race down to about 10th or 11th, I thought, or something. He lost nearly a lap. And then I saw it actually racing at Le Mans. No, I never even dreamt that I'd one day own it. I'd seen them obviously, and sort of the hype about them, you know, as the car was sort of being talked about, ready for launch, which would have been, I think from memory, 94, was it 94, 95, when the cars were sort of first became available. And then I saw one came up for auction in Paris. I think, I'm trying to remember actually if it was Bonhams or, I can't remember, to be honest, who the auction house was. But I saw it, and it was pretty much a spur of the moment thing. Myself and a pal of mine, we jumped in a 911 that I got at the time and sort of drove through the night to get down there, to get down to Paris at the Roland Garros place. I think it was Roland Garros where it was. And we got there the next morning, sort of looking slightly dishevelled, trainers, jeans and a white t-shirt on, and they basically didn't want to let us in, you know. So anyway, we managed to get in, asked them, you know, can you get a cup of coffee? They didn't want to know. So we stood at the back like two janitors, like, and eventually the car came up, and yeah, just I watched it, and I thought it was getting pretty close to my limit. What was my limit at the time? But anyway, fortunately, it sort of calmed down in the room. I was like, "Have you all done?" And I waited for him basically to drop the gavel, and I was like, put the paddle up at the back. There was like 100 people went, "Who's that?" at the back. And fortunately, yeah, we managed to get it. So they gave us a drink after as well. They managed to buy us a drink. It had done, I think, when I bought it, the only person that had driven it was one of the mechanics, Duncan, who I later got to know is a great guy. The car had done, I think, 300 kilometres when I got it, and the guy that owned it had never driven it. The only person that had put miles on it was the McLaren mechanic who used to go out. I think he'd been out and serviced it twice. So, but yeah, great car, fantastic chassis number. That was one really I should have kept, 007. But and strangely enough, I don't know if you know the story, but the guy who's actually got it now is the guy who was the auctioneer who dropped the hammer on the car. I don't think he'd mind me telling it. It's a chap called Simon Kidston who's got it now. But Simon was the auctioneer on that day, and he hammered the car down to me, and how things turn around, he now actually owns it. I'd had cars sort of prior to it, F40s. I think I'd had two by then. Various other sort of slightly lesser Ferraris, you know, if there is such a thing, than the F40s. I think I started off with a 308. I don't think there was anything, you know, some people will tell you now, there's still nothing compares to a McLaren F1. There are, because obviously the car is dated and aged. And technology being as it is, things have moved forward, you know. As a driver's car, there are better cars that handle better, but it's the overall package of the McLaren F1. There are very, very few cars that sort of come close to it as an overall package. But as you can probably tell, I think, personally, there are a couple of cars that maybe have equalled it or even eclipsed it for driver involvement. I used it as my wedding car when I got married. Slightly amusing that my time with the car lasted longer than it did with the wife at the time. But yeah, I had some great memories in it. Well, I went up to Scotland in it. You know, that's when sort of the car comes into its own. You know, I did like a round trip. I did a couple of sort of 250 mile trips in it, and it is surprisingly comfortable, and at that level it's surprisingly usable, you know. Whereas some of the sort of comparative cars, you wouldn't really want to do that in an F40. You know, you'd get out, you'd be frazzled. But in the McLaren F1, it's, you know, that was what it was built to do, and it did it very well. I think the quickest I went in it was about 190, 195 in it on a private road. And it definitely does go through a moment where it starts to waver. It sits on quite high profile tyres, on 70 series tyres, the F1. So yeah, and the other thing, I mean, if you fit the high downforce kit to them, which I've seen done to several of the cars, that doesn't really work because the car's riding too high for the high downforce kit to work. The GTR, well, I'd sold the black one, I sold the black one I sold the F1 road car, I think in about 2000 or 2001, and then about 3 years later, by which time I'd had the Enzo, I'd sold the Enzo, I was on to another F40. I'd got the Zonda at the time, the first customer Zonda that came into the UK. And then one of the Cottingham brothers, rang me up and said, would you fancy another McLaren F1? I said, yeah, but not the road car, like a GTR. And he said, yeah, it's a GTR. He said, we know where there is one. Would you be interested in it? And then we sort of started to discuss the history and which car it was. And I was like, obviously, yeah, I'd be interested in it. And it was in Australia at the time. A chap called Tony Raftis, I think from memory, owned it, controlled IBM Asia. Anyway, the car came over to the UK and we did a deal. I gave him an F40, the Zonda, and some money, and ended up owning an F1 GTR. It was in papaya. It had already been painted into historic orange papaya, it's called, that colour. The colour that it raced in, it was the Charlie Lamb Team Bugatti colours, which was basically white with the red and blue sort of checkered flags on it, whatever. So yeah, but by that time when I got it, it had already been put back into historic orange, as I think a lot of them are now. Although a lot of them now are actually going back into the race colours. People are putting them back into the race colours. The F1 GTR, in comparison to the F1, obviously the F1 is a purpose-built road car, whereas the F1 GTR is a straight-cut box. So you've got this really loud gearbox noise up to sort of 4,000 or 5,000 RPM. Hence the headphones inside the car, which if you're going to do any mileage in it, you really do need to wear them. But that dominates everything inside the car up to probably 4,500, 5,000 RPM, and then the exhaust note and the induction noise takes over. But it is tremendously loud inside, in a good way. You wouldn't particularly want to go away in the car for a weekend. It was more a sort of a weekend adrenaline rush, you know, for 30 minutes or an hour. Get up early Sunday morning or whatever, go and clear your head, come back, and the world's a better place, you know, when you've done it. I never took the F1 GTR back to Le Mans. Even then, the prices of them were sort of, you know, I mean, God forbid now. I don't think many people particularly use them. It's not, you can't leave it anywhere. You know, the insurance companies are having puppies if you even tell them that you've got one. You know, so it's sort of, I think it stops people from using them perhaps as much as, you know, what they'd like to. Very, very famously and rather embarrassingly, we went to, I think it was, I can't remember if it was Silverstone or Donington, and it was my birthday weekend, August bank holiday weekend, and strangely enough the Rolling Stones were playing just down the road in Sheffield, and so we had to get back from this race weekend. So I just jumped in the car down at, I think it was Donington, I'm not sure. Jumped in the car and thought, right, yeah, is there enough fuel in it? Yeah, because there's no fuel gauge in an F1 GTR. And every time you sort of turn off the master switch, which is that's what I used to do. I used to just, everything was how I wanted it on all the switches, and I just used to override everything with the master switch. But every time you turn the master switch off, it zeroes the trip for the fuel meter. So I jumped back in and I'm trying to work out, yeah, there's enough to get me home. And I managed to get as far as Meadowhall on the M1, and the car coughed and spluttered, and I thought, oh, please don't do this, please don't do this. Anyway, it coughed and spluttered, and I got about another mile out of it, and just after, I think it was just after the flyover at Tinsley, it died. And it coasted to a halt on the hard shoulder. Sort of, yeah, it let me, well, I let it down, it didn't let me down. And then we had to suffer the wait, of course, while all people were driving past and, you know, as they do, giving me certain gestures. And the AA were called. Anyway, they finished up, they recovered the car, because by the time, it's only got a very, very small battery on an F1 GTR. So even while you're waiting for the fuel to pump through, it just kills the battery. So the car wouldn't start by the time we'd managed to get the fuel in it. So if you can imagine, they picked us up, they loaded the car on a low loader, and the guy in the truck took me, I think it was to Don Valley Stadium, and dropped me off with the McLaren F1 GTR bright orange on the back of a pickup truck, dropped me off to go and see the Rolling Stones. So I watched, so that was quite a memorable trip. I used to work on the assumption that you were looking at probably 6 or 8 to the gallon. Right, and then you've got to figure out how much. Right, I've brimmed it, so the best way to do it is to brim it wherever you're going. Brim it, and I forget from memory exactly how big the tank is. So you try and work out. It's like, well, if it'll do 8 to the gallon, right? Have I got enough in to get me back? You know, and then God forbid if you sort of started pressing on because it was going to drop down to 6, and you were having to remember how you'd driven the car to try and work out whether or not it'd get you home if you'd done any miles in it. So let that be a lesson to you. At the time, it was, like you say, it was the 25th anniversary down at the Technology Centre at McLaren. We went down there. I think it was the largest ever gathering they'd had of the F1s to celebrate, you know, the 25 years. Some very, very famous pictures of all the F1s all the way around the lake parked up. So yeah, it was good to see them all. They actually, I can remember. I think it must have been the GTR because that was papaya. That was orange colour, and it had got a few stone chips on it. And he said to me, well, we've taken the liberty of mixing you a bit of paint, like for your stone chips. He said, and if you know your wife or your girlfriend, whatever's got a little nail brush, just dab it. It's like telling me how to do stone chips, you know. So I was like, okay, fine. And then when I looked on the bill, they charged me £80 for a little tin of fuel, and I mean a little, like as big as an egg cup, 80 quid for papaya orange paint, about that big. I was like, okay. At the time of the yellow 220S, which had set a few performance records at Bruntingthorpe, which I think it was eventually beaten by Tiff in a McLaren F1, which didn't go down too well with me. So I decided to try. That's how the first McLaren F1 came out. I decided I wanted that. So yeah, at the time I was fortunate to have the McLaren F1 and the 220S. So I could probably give you a direct comparison between the two. The 220S for me is even the 220, but it's such a good looking car, and I still think to this day, if I saw them both now, a standard 220 and the 220S, well, I did. I actually did go back and I bought a black 220, a standard car. But I think a 220 is such a good looking car. It's, you know, it's beautiful curves. It's just physically too big. If it was scaled down 10%, a little bit more compact, it would be pretty much spot on. Whereas if you put it and you're comparing it to one of the all-time greats, a McLaren F1, it's a hard act to follow. Well, the F1 followed the 220, but it's always going to be in the shadow almost of the F1, and the packaging of the F1, you know, it's an all-time great. It's got 3 seats and it's got luggage, and you know, the 220 didn't have any of that. So it was always going to struggle a bit.